Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. I am Gregory Hargreaves, Program Officer in the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society in the Hagley Museum and Library. Now, during these Hagley History Hangouts, we like to bring you some of the most innovative research being done using Hagley Library collections. And some of that work is being done by Dr. Rebecca Altman, who is joining me today. Rebecca is an environmental sociologist, an independent scholar and essayist, and is currently working on plastics, both in the environment and in the human body, including having published an article titled "Time Bombing the Future: How Synthetics Created in the 20th Century Have Become an Evolutionary Force, Altering Human Biology and the Web of Life," published in Eon Digital Magazine. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Let's sort of start with the basics. As a historian, I would find it really helpful if you could explain what an environmental sociologist is and does. What sort of questions and methods do you use?
Okay. I mean, I suppose there's quite a bit of overlap in potential methods, particularly the kinds of questions you might bring to an archive. But in particular, I mean, there's many ways to be an environmental sociologist, which is to study the interaction between, oh, I have a dog here who's piping up, between nature, society and the environment. I'm trained as a qualitative sociologist, so I don't work in big population numbers, but kind of trained in kind of ethnography, interviewing, archival work to really understand kind of that nexus between nature and society. In particular, so my doctoral work at Brown, I was looking at the history and evolution of the science of monitoring contaminants in bodies. So the way scientists might look at water or sediment or air sampling, but inside the human body. So kind of veins like rivers kind of thing. And so I was looking at that kind of trajectory of that science. And in particular, I was interested in how communities involved themselves in that kind of science as part of their, seeking redress and remediation. So they were kind of offering up biological samples through various kinds of programs to kind of put forth their exposures and to document their body burdens to seek kind of policy or some kind of redress. So I kind of was interested in those questions of science and society. Now I'm investigating plastics more generally, kind of where they come from and kind of their environmental histories and legacies. To do that as a sociologist, I guess, I don't know, I'm like drawn by C. Wright Mills, who's a kind of a early generation sociologist, said that sociology is the intersection of history with biography. And so looking at social forces and individual lives. So I guess that's part of my framework for studying environmental issues. So for me, my dad made plastics, so kind of trying to intersect kind of even my own biography into this larger story of understanding the social forces that kind of led to plastics and plastics mass production.
My dad made plastic too.
Ah, really? What kind of plastic?
Well, he worked at Klockner Pentaplast and Polybond, both of which were manufacturers of plastic sheeting.
Sheeting, like film or more solid?
More solid. Although I never saw the manufacturing process, I recall him bringing home pellets of the polymer from the manufacturing process. Really? What did your dad do?
He made polystyrene pellets for union carbide. His plant was in central New Jersey, but it was the original Bakelite plant. Union Carbide had bought out Bakelite, so Bakelite's kind of interesting for being, I call it kind of the breakthrough synthetic plastic. It was kind of this hybrid kind of early 20th century plastic that kind of led from more tree-based polymer modified plastic like celluloid into the kind of more modern thermoplastics like polystyrene, which were fully synthetic. Anyway, this the factory where he worked, it had the original brick smokestack up the middle. It said Bakelite in white letters down the face of it. So it was built during the Depression. Leo Baekeland himself had helped design the facility. And that's where he made polystyrene out of for about 10 years. And then he moved on. Had a different calling, I think, after a while. Oh, that's so great that we have that connection. Did that lead you into your own research topics, into history?
Well, somewhat, insofar as I do come from a pretty long line of industrial workers, and then there wasn't an obvious path into that type of career for me. And it made me quite wonder, well, what was this process of industrialization and deindustrialization that my own family had lived through, and sort of as an intergenerational experience? So indirectly, I'd say yes.
And you write about that?
Oh, yeah, about industrial history in particular, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But you haven't taken the kind of biographical you haven't intersected the biographical piece?
Not yet, although maybe book 2 or 3 one day.
Oh, I will be watching. That's very exciting.
Right. Thank you for the vote of confidence.
Yeah.
So what Hagley collections have you looked at to help you explore this story of plastic, and I guess as an interlocutor between the social and the environmental?
I mean, I have to say, I'll admit, I've been a remote or digital or distance user of the collections. So I appreciate how much is digitized and visible. So I can say one of the biggest sources of information has been reading DuPont magazine, back issues of that. Plastics in general. So, so one of the, as I was mentioning before we started rolling, one of the most important books on plastics, Jeff Meekley's American Plastics, I think it was originally published. Well, my copy says 97, but that's the softback, so maybe it was before that. Anyway, he is an American studies scholar and spent quite a bit of time at Hagley in the 90s. And so his footnotes is probably a lot like your finding aids. So he worked very extensively with that collection, and I rely on him as a secondary source in a lot of my work, and heavily use his footnotes. I think at the time, Hagley still had access to the Society for Plastics Industry, one of the trade association's documents, but I think those are no longer, mostly no longer in the holdings. But so his work is really an important way to capture some of that material. But most specifically, I've gone in to kind of look at the history of Teflon, and in particular, I was very interested in DuPont's pavilions and chemistry showcases that it hosted at the 1939 and again 64 World Fairs in New York. And so I appreciated all of the visuals that are on the line, so I could really see what was done and how it was organized, videos, and one in particular from the 1964 World's Fair that I loved about all the different DuPont polymers. Anyway, it was like a cabaret. Have you seen it?
I'm not sure that I have in particular.
Okay. I'll send it to you. I'll send you the link.
Well, I do appreciate you mentioning how much research you can conduct remotely in the Hagley collections, because our team of archivists have worked tremendously to make a great deal of material available in a digital format. And I wonder if you could maybe describe what some of the advantages are of being able to immerse yourself, even from a distance, in the Hagley collection.
Yeah, well, so for example, I wrote a piece for Eon magazine it ran in 2019, and in part it's the story of it's a story of a kind of the invention of legacy weaving materials. SCBs are one, which wasn't a DuPont product, but Teflon and one of the chemicals that DuPont purchased from 3M to make it kind of are part of that larger story. And so it was a very complicated story, and it's not a kind of story that you can tell from the holdings in any one archives. In fact, the story resides across archives. I think 6 or 7 different archives I had to kind of cull materials from to piece that story together like a puzzle. And so to be able to kind of visit and revisit and visit again and visit again and again, a digitized archives is huge because, you know, as each part of the puzzle that was the final essay came into view, I got new clues about like, oh, all of a sudden this other person seemed really important, and I could go back in and there he was in the pages of DuPont magazines sculpting Teflon or something like that. And so, you know, this learning process is so iterative that I don't think I would have been able to get to it if I had come and sat and plunked myself, you know, there for months. You know, I would have been able to puzzle it together because I needed all of these other pieces in place. So it's that iterative visiting. And you know, who can do that? You know, with funding or timing or children or COVID or, you know, all of that. So I truly am a big fan of and grateful for all that work, digitizing so much.
And more continues to be added to the digital collections all the time.
Yeah.
Now, did you make any particularly exciting discoveries, say a particular source or document that just made the light bulb or the fireworks go off?
Yes, in fact, so that essay is the story of kind of 3 different people who were each involved with different companies who were involved in the process, in the projects of leaving a legacy on purpose, using what ended up being legacy leaving contaminants or materials in the process. And that story did not come together until there were 3 of them, you know, because I had tried to pitch the story with one of them, didn't fly as a narrative. And it was only in getting the 3 of them together that the story cohered and was of a narrative that, you know, a magazine would find publishable. So, you know, kind of once I met this character named Domenico Montano, who was a sculptor hired by DuPont to do some of the installations at their 1939 World Fair, did this story that I wanted to tell about Westinghouse and about some of the early perfluorinated or, you know, PFAS chemicals. The whole story cohere. And he went on to become a DuPont employee. And so there's kind of quite a bit about him in the magazines, and there's even more about him on site that I couldn't access because I was working from home. But just discovering who he was and being able to kind of pull that thread eventually led to the coherence of the whole narrative. So it wasn't a smoking gun of a document, but it was his whole profile that I could piece together and then use that lead that I got from there to kind of go through, because there's actually quite a bit about him in the New York Public Library archives, including some incredible DuPont related photographs that you might want to go get, that I could kind of then go back to those archives and work with them again. And just so the story just deepened and further.
Well, who was Domenico Montano and what was his story?
Well, what I was particularly interested about him was, you know, he was I don't even know how to pronounce his name. This is the problem with working with archives, right? You invent your own pronunciations of things. He was a kind of a wonderful sculptor who had done some work even in like the subway tiles in New York City, and DuPont brought him on as an installation artist. In fact, I think he did a bunch of installations at the 39 World's Fair, if I'm not mistaken. But he sculpted this gigantic backlit mural for DuPont telling the history of chemistry and what DuPont could make from the trinity of, what was it, coal, air, and water, or something like that, as they called it. And it was these giant lucite plastic figures kind of reenacting the history of chemistry.
Mm.
And lucite is like plexiglass, which is another like more of a branded name from another company, but they could take on color and they could be kind of lit from behind, and they were built onto, as I remember, kind of a curved wall. I mean, like the engineering capacity of this would not have been possible without plastics. So he became known for being kind of working with this new medium and what he could create with it. So he was later brought on to DuPont. I believe he consulted on kind of colors and paints, but when Teflon came along, you know, he was given the chance to sculpt it and carve it like a block of marble. And I think I read in one of the DuPont magazines that he was one of the first to do that. So I think he also helped develop some of the marketing campaigns. Apparently there's a guy named Mr. Teflon that he helped design, though I couldn't find pictures of it remotely. I really tried. But I became particularly interested in him because after DuPont, or maybe towards the end of his time at DuPont in the late 60s, he sculpted a beautiful piece that's at the Copeland Sculpture Gardens in Delaware. Sorry, I'm keeping my dog active with pencils. This is probably bad dog ownership. And it was, I forget what the name of the piece was called, but it was something, I think it was called Protecting Future Generations. And that piece really struck me because it's this piece of an adult kind of hovering over a small child, kind of holding kind of this gargoyles at bay. And I thought it was a very instructive piece to have come from someone who had been inside industrial chemistry for so long and understood its benefits, but also its consequences. And so I became fascinated with that piece, again, because here was someone who worked with legacy leaving materials, trying to do some art that was to be a different kind of legacy, and that it was not sculpted out of Teflon or lucite. It was sculpted out of stone. So that's kind of that narrative art was what fascinated me about him.
Well, how then do plastics or synthetic materials go from a medium of creativity, to something that's inside our bodies and in circulating in our ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, well, kind of playing off the Teflon story, you know, one of the chemicals that made the Teflon process, I'm not going to say possible, because they were able, I mean, the kind of early DuPont engineers were making it before the addition of the chemical we now know of as PFOA, perfluorooctanoic acid. But it certainly eased the process of Teflon's polymerization, Teflon being in some of its applications a plastic. And so, you know, a chemical like PFOA, I call a plastic helpmate. It was a polymerization aid. So when I was doing my dissertation work at Brown, PFOA was one of the chemicals I had studied because 70,000 people living outside the DuPont plant there had their blood submitted for analysis for this chemical. And so, you know, it had been used by DuPont for 50 decades to polymerize Teflon at its Washington Works plant near Parkersburg on the Ohio River. And then, but it wasn't needed in the final product. And so it was released. And so it became part of the drinking water supply and part of the bodies of those living from those drinking water supplies. So I had been studying PFOA since probably 2005 and really wanted to understand where it came from. Like, what does it mean for a body to harbor it? I mean, even as scientists were kind of working to figure out what it means for human health, as a sociologist, I was looking at it as kind of what does it mean to kind of harbor history, as kind of a traces of history of a 20th century innovation. And so I said, well, if it's going to be in the body, I wanted to know where it came from and why it was here, and how it came to be and what were the geopolitical circumstances of its development. And so that's what led me into that essay project that went on into Eon.
Mm.
So that's like one very specific answer to your question and not a general answer, but I don't know.
One example, yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, are there any perhaps implications for public policy that we might draw from your work?
Well,
meaning this relationship between plastics and human bodies and the rest of the natural world must be regulated in some way to protect those involved. Which is to say, to mitigate against the negative consequences from industrial chemistry. So are there perhaps some implications for how best to do so?
I mean, it's a pretty, the ways that I'm thinking about this now, and specific to kind of PFOA, DuPont took it out of its process. It's been addressed at the level of the United Nations, but what has happened since then is a series of kind of substitutions that I think scientists are suggesting have complications of their own. And so when I think of plastics, I don't just think of the actual material itself that we use. I think of like the network of integrated plants that made this color plastic with these properties possible. So that includes kind of a whole series of plants producing other petrochemicals that that make plastics additive. And so to kind of think about kind of human health and bodies, occupational health, community health, is to kind of understand kind of that whole process and that leads to plastics production. And so kind of any toxics policy, it's very bumbly and badly.
Quite all right.
What I mean to say is it's kind of to deal with plastics as a problem. You can't just deal with the plastics as a waste problem.
Mm-hmm.
It is an industrial problem, relying on the kind of toxicity of the materials that go into plastics production, I guess, is the way that I want to think about. I want to kind of talk about that today, which is not to say that all these single-use plastics are not a problem. They are, but they're also a problem upstream as well. Like places where they're produced, all the chemistries that go into making that plastic, these are upstream problems that require attention at the level of feedstock and production, as well as kind of downstream, fishing them out of the ocean or whatever.
Right. Human bodies don't only come into contact with plastics and synthetics as consumers, but in all other aspects of our lives and as occupants of the planet.
Yes. And so, in terms of kind of the ways that I'm currently thinking about this are these linkages between kind of these things that I thought, originally had thought of as like isolated pollutants, because we tend to tackle pollutants one at a time. PFOA, and then PFOA's replacement, and then the PCB, and then the flame, other flame, instead of them being kind of part of a broader category of production that is, set up to kind of support plastics production. It's kind of all of a piece, and it's a much more integrated system. And so how do we think about the materials that are, that make up our modern lives, and how are they connected, and how do they all share kind of the same root as byproducts of oil or gas production? But I think the other thing to think about is, I'm really interested in the kinds of materials that are legacy leaving, that are the kinds of materials that have the durability as designed, as engineered to persist for long time horizons. And now they do. And so what does that mean for design today? Design of molecules, and also design of materials made from those molecules. Can legacy be designed out? Is it possible to create items that are biocompatible and ecologically compatible at in their afterlives. Or so they don't have afterlives as well.
Right.
So there's a design challenge there too.
Yeah, and that's fascinating. And where are you going to take your work next? What's next on your research agenda? What are you working on?
I just finished up a centennial retrospect on the kind of merger of petroleum and chemistry into petrochemistry. And that's going to run in Orion magazine this summer. That's all based on archival work using Union Carbide's documents scattered as well. And I also this past year signed a contract with Scribner Books, and I'm working on a book that uses this intimate history approach, which is the intersection of biography and history, sociology of plastics, to tell this bigger story. And so it is a story of my dad and his years making plastics, and our joint journey together to understand the kind of history and legacy of plastics. And it's also woven in with the writings and life of the writer Primo Levi, who I think most people associate with the Holocaust, but he was also a chemist, a PhD chemist and an industrial chemist. And if you understand polymer science, you would read him as a plastics maker too. He made the kind of plastics that would coat wires. Anyway, so I kind of have reread his body of work that's translated into English to bring that into the story too. So I have kind of to wave into this story of 20th century plastics through him and my dad a generation later, to kind of get at this deeper wisdom of what do we learn about plastics by getting to know two people whose lives were tangled up in it for a while. So that's the book I'm currently working on.
That's great. I can't wait to read it. No rush though. These things take time.
COVID is a hard time to write a book and think big. And the one blessing of it all is all of the archivists who are still working and been very kind to me, sending me things remotely. It's all possible because of archivists. I keep a running list of all of the archives and researchers that have helped me work over the past year.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with me today and sharing your work with us.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thank you for pulling me out of my rabbit hole.
Sure. And to the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society, and our research grants and fellowships, why don't you join us online? Visit hagley.org. That's hagley.org. Don't be a stranger.